Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. This is a show about astrology, as you well know. Those of you who listen to me frequently, I appreciate your support, and I'm always happy to be here for you. I've got a huge archive of shows out there, which you can get on iTunes and also on other podcast distributors as well. I'm also up there as well. And my website is turningofthewheel.com or chrisflisher.com. And I've also got turningofthewheel.tv as well. If you're interested in some sort of educational astrology videos, they're up there as well. I'll be getting my guest on in a few seconds here. I just want to remind you about my newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon. In there, you'll find a couple paragraphs of mundane astrology as it applies to all of us, and then I break it out into the individual signs beyond that. And I encourage you to read your sun sign and your rising sign and any other sign you might know in your chart. If you know your chart that well, read your moon as well and see what it says. Okay, so let's get on with the show here. My guest today is Annand. I've had him on before. He's a wonderful astrologer out of Toronto. And we're going to be talking about the upcoming Mars conjunct Saturn in Capricorn. And so it's got a pretty hot topic, I think, especially with Mars running through this area of the chart, as well as what it pertains to the United States and everything. So I think it'll be a pretty good topic. So welcome to the show, Alan. It's always great to have you back on.
Hey, Chris. Thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah, it's great. So we were sort of chatting back and forth on Facebook or whatever the other day about the Mars Saturn conjunction coming up on April the 2nd. And even though it's not something that's an unusual alignment per se, it still has. I guess it's the neighborhood in which it's occurring that makes it more volatile, I think, lately. I'm curious.
Well, as much as anything, I'd say it's the nature of the planets that makes it potentially volatile as well. Because, as you know, Mars and Saturn have always been traditional enemies in the astrological circles. Mars is hot and fiery. Saturn is cold and distant. And they have all kinds of associations between the two of them that make them very different. Mars, for instance, is a force for motion, momentum, let's say. And Saturn is more of a retarding force. Right. So if there's a mundane equivalent to have them both operating at the same time, think of this. You go out to your car, you sit in the seat, you turn on the ignition, you put the gear into drive, and then you press one foot on the gas and one foot on the brakes. And what does your car do? It goes, ah, ah, ah. And where do you go?
Absolutely nowhere. Yeah.
So basically, it's as my grandpa used to say, all revved up and no place to go.
Yeah. And it's interesting, especially in Capricorn, because, Mars is exalted there, so it's going to have an extra oomph there. And Saturn, of course, is the ruler, so that's got more powerful there. So this could really be a real loggerheads of sorts, I guess is a good word for it.
It always is when two planets combine within 1 degree of each other. Now, in Vedic circles, we call this planetary war. There's a Sanskrit term for it. It's graha yuddha, which basically just means the same thing, a war between two planets. But we need to define what do we mean when we say planets. So planetary war really only exists between one of the 5 true planets. Excuse me for the moment here. I'll just sort of set the frame of reference. In Vedic astrology and in traditional astrology, for instance, we don't use the trans-Saturnian planets. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are not used by people like Deborah Holding or Chris Brennan or whomever, who utilize a traditional form of astrology. So you've got the classic
Hellenistic astrology,
7 planets ruling the 12 signs. When we talk about true planets, we are excluding the luminaries as well, because the sun is a star, and technically speaking, the moon is a satellite of Earth. So we're talking about true planets that are like the Earth. And what are those? That's Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. So by definition, planetary war happens when one of these 5 true planets get within 1 degree of longitude, celestial longitude, between each other. 1 degree or less. So, just to be clear, it need not be the exact conjunction, which, Mars Saturn will exactly conjunct, shortly before noon on 2nd of April.
April 2nd.
But they actually enter within this 1 degree orb on, the afternoon of March 31st. And then they will approach to partile conjunction on the April 2nd, and then they'll separate, but still be within 1 degree of orb up to, mid-morning of April the 4th. So that entire period, which in the case of these planets, because Mars is moving, along fairly well, this is only a 4-day period. As you can imagine, if it were Jupiter and Saturn, 2 slow-moving planets, they would approach their conjunction. They would be within a 1 degree orb for perhaps weeks, and then perfect conjunction, and then be separating for another week or 2. Right. So depending on the planet, the planetary war will be brief, or it will be more extended. But war is war. If you want to think of a mundane analogy too of this notion of 2 planets crowding each other's spaces in the sky, imagine yourself getting into an empty elevator, in some high rise, and you start up and you get on the 7th floor, the elevator stops, and somebody else gets in. And even though the elevator is room for, let's say 10 or 12 people, the person comes and they stand pressed right up against you, like the way people end up pressed up against each other on a subway. During rush hour, we're used to that, and there's a reason for it, to be crowded, right?
Right.
But in the elevator, there's no excuse for it. And so we, give the person a shove and say, hey, back off, give me my space. Mm-hmm. So the planets are kind of like that as well, too. If they crowd each other to that degree, within 1 degree of celestial longitude. Now, so this could be within the same sign, as happens between Mars and Saturn in Capricorn, but it could just as easily happen in the last, one planet could be, let's just change it up here. Mars could be at 2930 of Capricorn, and Saturn could be at 020 of Aquarius.
Right.
In which case, they would be within 1 degree of each other, just not in the same sign. Mm-hmm. But look up in the sky, and you can't see the dividing lines between the zodiacal signs anyway. And depending on your frame of reference, if you're Western astrologer, this conjunction occurs in Capricorn, but if you're a Vedic astrologer like myself, it occurs in Sagittarius.
Right.
So it's what you see. When you look up in the sky and you see those 2 planets that close together, then that's where you get that crowding effect occur. And so then there is a kind of a tussle between the 2 of them. And then depending on what those planets are associated with, in a generic sense, Mars and Saturn are significators of different things in the phenomenal world. Mars, warriors, fighters, fire. Saturn, starvation, poverty, the elderly, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And it goes on and on with many associations. But where it's really of value is in a specific chart, where Mars may be the ascendant lord, and Saturn may be the ruler of something else. And then when you have this war, you can now translate this war into something symbolic of a struggle between persons indicated in the chart. So let's just, for instance, say that in this case, this is a war occurring in tropical Capricorn.
Right.
So it's between Saturn and Mars. Mm-hmm. So let's say that you have a person with Capricorn rising. So Saturn is in its own sign in first house. Mars is there too. But now in in that individual's chart, what does Mars rule? Well, in this case, Mars would rule the 4th house of Aries, and it would also rule the 11th house of Scorpio.
Right.
So, if, the simplest thing to do is just translate this into who are the people represented there. Obviously, you can go on with this, but if you just think of people. So, the ascendant represents the individual.
Right.
Who does the 4th house represent? Who does the 11th house represent? Now, here, we can get divergences between Western astrology and Vedic astrology as to what the houses rule. In Vedic astrology, the 4th house is the mother. In both systems, tropical and Vedic, the 11th house is friends and social acquaintances. Mm-hmm. So let's take the mother. So if you've got this war between Saturn, Lord of the First, and Mars, Lord of the Fourth, you have a potential conflict between the self and the mother. Mm-hmm. So what can that mean? That could mean purely a conflict between yourself and your mom, but it could also mean some kind of, event or circumstance transpiring that is not good for the mother. Right. An accident, a surgery, a fall, a raging fever, a headache, because this conjunction
right, of course. Yeah, I could also see it as a domestic issue as well. I mean, I know that's more Western astrology, but I do think of that in terms of sort of a domestic dispute.
By all means, I mean the 4th house in Western astrology, the 4th is the domicile, the residence.
Right.
In Vedic astrology, the 4th house also includes one's vehicles as well, too. So you, for instance, could have difficulty with something around the home. It could be a stove fire because Mars is involved.
Yep.
It could be an electrical failure in your vehicle or some other sort of mechanical breakdown, again, because Mars rules things mechanical and Saturn is structural, and the two, again, they struggle with each other. I mean, Mars-Saturn conjunctions are a common factor in accidents of whatever kind, or mechanical breakdowns, or, in some cases, even earthquakes.
Right, which will be very, we are sort of overdue. I don't like to say that, but we are sort of overdue for an earthquake. We haven't had much earthquake news lately, but that's not to say it's going to happen, but this is the type of event that would precipitate that.
Thankfully, not in my part of the country.
Right. Yeah. Same here.
Yes,
yeah.
I sympathize with. I have a client who lives in Berkeley, and she's considering moving because the thought of earthquakes in the fault zone is something that literally keeps her awake at night.
Oh, I would imagine. I mean, especially if you live, and not really prepared for it. I mean, they've been told this is coming for many years, but we're not really prepared for it, I don't think, out there.
Exactly. So, I mean, this sort of thing could be precipitated by that kind of conjunction. If you rotate the chart, who will this affect? I mean, in terms of individuals, it'll affect people with Mars-ruled ascendants, because Mars is in the war, or Saturn-ruled ascendants. So in other words, Aries or Scorpio rising will be affected, or Capricorn or Aquarius rising will be affected, personally, because their ascendant lords will be involved. Quite likely the worst for Aquarius ascendants, because picture this now, the war occurs in tropical Capricorn,
right,
which is in the 12th house from an Aquarius ascendant.
Right.
For every other ascendant, if it's an Aries ascendant, that Saturn-Mars conjunction would happen in the 10th house.
Exactly.
That could as much be a conflict with your boss and some sort of career issue. If it's Scorpio rising, Capricorn is in the 3rd house, and so that could be a conflict with brothers or sisters, something to do with documentation, bad communication of some sort, traditional things, a move that you're trying to make.
Yeah, exactly. Something else I'd like to bring up, though, I also am of the opinion, but I'd like to understand, get your view, is that when you have this type of energy, there's always the potential for, I mean, as you mentioned, there's always the potential for this sort of, flashpoint kind of, war, as you mentioned. I also think that the kind of tension also leads to the possibility for great breakthroughs as well, or of a nature whereby it's almost the inverse of the war. Not that it's a peace-like invitation. I would never go that so far, but something might be very. You might be able to push a project forward. Or you might be able to get something optimistic as a result of it as well.
Yeah, I think so too, and it would depend. The relationship between these signs. And we're working with a limited number of signs, as I say, Aries, Scorpio, Capricorn, and
Aquarius. Yeah.
Some of them, have positive associations with each other, first and fourth house or first and third. And in some instances, yeah, it can be. A person who, you're struggling with something, but then to use your words, make some sort of a breakthrough, kind of like in the way a marathon runner after 15 kilometers or 25 kilometers is feeling totally exhausted and wasted and really wants to quit. But then they get their so-called second wind.
Their runner's high, yeah, and you keep on going.
Kind of breakthrough in that regard.
That's kind of like based on momentum, I think. And if once momentum is going, it depends upon the direction of the momentum, I think, really, and how you can direct that. So we do have some control over that. If you're in a situation where you see this potential rising and you have the opportunity to make a statement, you could easily perhaps turn that in a way that was positive.
It does represent a fierce struggle, though, because of the nature of the two planets. Mars with its momentum, and yet Saturn with its inertia. A motive force versus a retarding force. And traditionally, the two have always been enemies. So of all planetary pairs, contrast that, for instance, with... we'll stay with this Mars-Saturn thing because that is what's happening. But the broader topic is the phenomenon of planetary war. And so a planetary war between Venus and Jupiter, which happens as well, too, because the two planets get within 1 degree of each other, and that does cause a problem. But now you're working with two benefics.
Right. And that will be an opposition when coming up, you're talking about, right?
Well, I'm only talking about planetary war when it does happen, when they circle around to
okay, right, I got you. Yep.
In the very same place. When you can actually look in the sky and see them there, that conjunction becomes...
I like that approach better. Yeah, I think it makes more sense, yeah.
And there are lots of famous people that have, these planetary wars going on in their chart. And there's all kinds of rules. You might be interested in this. For resolving, all Vedic astrologers, when they look at this planetary war or whatever planetary war occurs, among the other eligible planets as well. To remember, there are 5 planets available to engage in war. But it often it's useful to try to determine, well, actually, who is the winner in this particular war?
Right. I was just going to ask that.
Yeah, and so there are some rules of engagement, if I can use that term. And there's an associate of mine by the name of Edith Hathaway, whom many tropical astrologers might know. I first met her in New York at a financial astrology conference some 20 years ago. And she was, a member of NCGR, et cetera, in years gone by. And then, like me, she moved on into Vedic astrology. But she's written a lengthy article on planetary war. And she sets out, the rules of engagement. And so basically, in a nutshell, who wins a planetary war? Well, you can think of the mundane world. Often it's the biggest fighter of the two that will win the war. And so Jupiter and Saturn are more likely to win over the smaller planets. Right. That's one thing. These are her criteria first. I must preface this by saying that. Then there's an issue of brightness, and that often goes along with size. But Jupiter, for instance, is always the brightest, and it's actually also the biggest. And so unless something else, enters into play, Jupiter is usually the winner of a planetary war, no matter with whom it associates. But then another major factor is, and here you think militarily.
I know. That's what worries me.
Yeah, when two combatants meet on a field of battle, there is usually a struggle to achieve, to take, and to hold what? The higher ground.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because from the vantage of height, you can see further. You also have an advantage in that your opponent has to struggle up a hill or an incline in order and tire himself out in coming to meet you. Your spears and stones and arrows fly farther as you shoot them down rather than up. So this is a factor as well. And all other things being equal, let's say you had two planets that appeared equally bright at the time. Let's say maybe it's Venus and Mercury. But now what you do is you consider declination, which is just another way of saying elevation.
Right.
How high do they appear above the ecliptic?
Mm-hmm.
And the all other things being equal, it's the planet who is higher, holds the higher ground, that will win in that case. But, brightness rules,
overall.
hugely.
Right.
Yeah, overall.
Yeah, exactly.
So my teacher's rule for this, he said, this is Hart Defoe, simplifies this radically just by saying the brightest planet will win. But if you can't determine brightness, and there's a couple ways there that you cannot determine brightness. In one instance, the two planets may seem equally bright, and then all you can do is look at their elevation, one above the other.
Right.
But the other thing is if you're dealing with a birth chart, and the planetary war has occurred at night when it's not visible, or at a time when the planets are below the horizon.
I was going to say, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Then you may not be able to judge their brightness because you can't actually see it. And the other case is if it happens during the day, the glare of the sunlight will disable you from being able to determine the relative brightness of Venus and Jupiter, no matter how bright they normally are at night. In the daytime, you can't tell.
You can't tell, of course not. Yeah.
And so then all you can do then is look at your ephemeris and determine that, well, I can't see them, but I know that Venus is higher in the sky than Jupiter. And in such a case, Venus could win that war, simply because brightness is no longer something that the human eye can judge under the circumstances.
Right. You would need some sort of device to be able to tell that.
Yeah, and well, yes, you'd have to go down into a mine and look up the shaft and hope that those two planets would align.
Well, you were over there, over your head, exactly. I get your analogy.
That's the only way you can do that. So that's tricky. Now, some people will, are keen enough to know the result of this war that, many programs will, tell you, the declination. Well, they all do, for that matter. You can get sort of an astronomical report on any chart, and it'll tell you what the declination of the planets are, and therefore which one is higher. But my teacher, Hart Defoe, he's gone so far as to purchase a professional copy of software called Starry Sky.
Oh, I've heard of that. Yep.
That which is much beloved by amateur astronomers, because you can
see, you can tell where it is.
Yeah, you can rotate, and then you can see and identify the planets, and then you can go outside with your binoculars or your telescope, because now you've mapped them on the software. You actually know where to find them in the sky. So he'll use that, and furthermore, that program will also tell you the astronomical brightness. So it won't force you poor human with your less than perfect eyesight from judging which of those two is brighter. It'll actually tell you astronomically which is brighter. And so you can get the actual scientific opinion on that regarding brightness and declination, and in that way you can sort that out.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discovery. I know very well. I'm very familiar with the Starry Sky software, and it is really valuable for that purpose.
Well, now you can, if you've still got it, you can start using it with Mars and Saturn. I've been up on the roof at 5 o'clock in the morning for the past couple of nights trying to get a sighting on Mars and Saturn, but the sky has not been cooperating.
No, I know. It's a tough time of year to try to get that. It really is.
I live in the middle of Toronto, too, and there's lots of ambient light, even at 5 in the morning because of street lights and so on. And all you need is a little bit of a haze in the sky, and it gets very difficult to make these judgments.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. It's a difficult spot to be. And so that when you stop and think about, so there's a lot of other variables that go into the determination of who wins. But when we look at this through the cultural lens, and we see where we're going, maybe we'll get into this in the second half of the show because we're just about halfway through. When we see sort of the cultural manifestations of this, or someone who has a powerful placement of this in their chart, for example, would feel the impact of it, and it would come to fruition. And we sort of see the previews of that sort of marching up to some key figures that we know of on this public stage, and there's a couple of number of people who I know we could talk about. It does become more relevant and more because we can see this sort of like the sneak previews of what's happening. We can see the building pressure, this applying pressure of what's about to happen.
Right. You have somebody in mind?
Well, I think you know who I'm talking about. But we'll get into that.
Well, okay, I can offer a comment on that if you're talking about the current president.
Right.
Is that where you're going?
Yeah. Well, that's something I thought we could pick up in the second half of the show for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll keep it light and keep it brief. And I have some other things to say about this as well too. So tell me when you're ready to transition, and we'll. Yeah, well,
we can take a break right now. It's a good idea. Why not? I really want to get the topic going. So when we do get there, we'd rather keep it going than having to break. We're talking today with Alan Annand. His website is Navamsa. It's navamsa.com. He's an astrologer out of Toronto. He does both Vedic and traditional Western astrology, as well as also does palmistry. And I've done all three of those with him, and it's fascinating. I encourage you to reach out to him. Again, his website is Navamsa, navamsa.com. And we'll be back in a few minutes after the break, and we'll pick up with some of these more popular figures that we're referring to and see what we can figure out on them. Okay, so hang in there. We'll be right back.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
Hi, your host, Chris Flisher here. I've been producer and host of this podcast and radio show for the past 10 years. My goal has always been to provide enlightening, progressive, and logical discussions about where we are as a species and how we move ourselves further down the road towards our greater potential. I believe astrology provides a great tool for observing our progress and awakening our consciousness to becoming a whole, better, and more complete individuals. I have sought to invite the best contemporary guests, thought leaders, and progressive minds to discuss topics that concern us all, regardless of your beliefs. Consider making a contribution through PayPal to help keep the great wheel turning so that I can continue for the next 10 years along the same enlightened path. As always, I thank you for your support.
Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Alan Annand. His website is Navamsa, NAVAMSA.com. And we're talking today about the Mars-Saturn conjunction coming up in Capricorn on April the 2nd when they hit exact conjunction at that point. And we're talking about how this sort of planetary war might manifest itself on the world stage with key players. We do see a lot of activity in certain sectors of the world where we could easily see something like this being a triggering event for something like that. And when I always use the analogy when I wrote my newsletter this week about the pots are boiling on the back on the stove. We've got a Mars pot that's boiling and we've got a Saturn pot that's boiling. What does that happen? It's drawing our attention and demanding our focus. And so as we were talking earlier about what you were saying about our president, it'd be interesting to hear your view of that through what we had started to talk about before the break.
Okay, just before we get into that, there's one qualifying remark I want to say about the planetary war. I was talking earlier about saying, if possible, we try to determine the winner. Because
right, remember that. Yep.
That's germane for a number of reasons. If you're working with a personal horoscope, it allows you to determine, like, who's losing this battle, me or my wife? or who's winning it, my brother or my dad? Because, they may be, the planets involved may represent those people, me or someone else or a member of my family. And this is often where this is quite useful, is stick with the people in your life. Your siblings, your mother, your children, your servants or staff, if you've got them, your partner, your father, your boss, your friends. I mean, there's some houses in the chart that don't lend themselves easily to connecting with people in the life. But, if we push ourselves, we can. But, the low-hanging fruit is there for many of us, and we're familiar with that. So it may be necessary in some circumstances to determine the winner or loser of a planetary war. You could have a horary question where, basically your client is asking you, am I going to win this lawsuit or is my opponent? And he needs to know, because he wants to know whether he can afford to put another 50 grand into legal fees and make it worth his while,
right, or
should he settle out of court and be done with it? You see where I'm going?
Yeah.
So we need to know the planetary, the winner of the planetary war in that circumstance. Now, in those limited situations where really it's necessary to know the winner, I will struggle to do that, using whatever means I have available to me. But as a fallback position, consider this, and this is an analogy now from Hart Defoe. When two parties enter into a war, I mean a serious war, is there a clear winner or are they both losers? Let's take as an example Iran and Iraq in the 1980s. They fought for what, 5-7 years? It was devastating for both countries. If you want a different analogy, imagine two heavyweight fighters who go 15 rounds with no decision. With no knockout.
Right. Then you're both taking a beating the whole time.
That is brutal. Do they feel like do they have a tough time next morning when they get out?
Of course, and you have to ask yourself, who the heck wins? I mean, nobody really wins in war. There's always a cost to be paid, no matter what happens. There's always going to be some drawback. And so you're right. There really is no winner. We've seen countless wars where billions of dollars were spent, thousands of lives were lost, and there really is there's no happy ending ever.
Yeah, and the heavyweight fighter analogy is pretty good too, because you can imagine how awful you feel the next day. Muhammad Ali and Liston, did he fight? Or no, Mike I'm forgetting
Tyson.
Mike Tyson.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not right either, but anyway, you get the idea.
I know you're right. Yeah, I know. I think it was Sonny Liston, maybe. Sonny Liston.
Yeah, he fought him for sure anyway. It's not fresh in my memory, but never mind that. Here's the thing. If you just accept that notion that in a planetary war, both get damaged, you can then look at someone's chart and say, this circumstance of planetary war in the chart is going to hurt two parties. Maybe you and your wife, because of divorce or whatever, or maybe your kids and your wife, or maybe one of your parents and your kids, or whatever the case may be. So there's, direct and there's collateral damage, which is sometimes very extensive. But at least if you can recognize there's a war, and it potentially can harm both parties to some significant degree, you can extract from that a little nugget of interpretation that you can offer to the client, and they can understand what they may face during this particular time. In Western astrology, it would be probably activated by the transit, but in a birth chart, through the lens of Vedic astrology, you might be identifying the major and minor planetary periods.
I see, yeah.
That exist and say, during this time, this is what's going to happen. And these people might well suffer during this period. Anyway, so that's the easier way to approach the planetary war thing, rather than obsessing over who's going to win specifically. Just acknowledge that both are going to get seriously hurt, and go into this with your heads up, or be prepared for it. So, Mr. Trump, I'm working with a Vedic chart, as I always do. So Trump in sidereal has a Leo ascendant. And so this conjunction of Mars-Saturn will occur in Sagittarius in his chart, which is the 5th house. And so this represents the potential for some serious repercussions for one or the other of his children.
Right. We already see the preview for that. I was going to say it has to do with his children, and in some capacity, of course, and their role within the White House is under scrutiny.
Yeah. So because it's occurring in the 5th house, but this can also, for him too, could be an issue around his own marriage, because picture this: if you're Leo rising, what's your 7th house?
Oh, yes.
Aquarius.
Of course, yeah.
And Saturn is the lord of Aquarius.
Right.
And Mars rules, 2 other houses in the chart, which, could be either one's desire to move on, or one's desire to have a career of one's own, or one's social status. I'm thinking of Melania now, for instance.
Of course.
Because Saturn would rule her in this instance. And Mars now represents her social status. And as you can imagine, as one porn star or playmate after another comes out of the woodwork, as they now seem to be happening, how horrible is this for her, who has to, she may have had suspicions before, but now they're being confirmed on a weekly basis, and more.
And it forces her in a position where she sort of has to respond. She can only be quiet for so long. And I suspect, knowing him, he's probably got some sort of prenup for sure, and it's probably an NDA on her as well, non-disclosure. But I think that she might I think this is what's going to bring him down, to be honest, is the whole affair thing. Because then that would directly, reflect on one of his children. His son, his younger son, who's only 8 or 9 years old, is going to feel the impact of that.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. So all children too, because this Mars-Saturn conjunction happens in sidereal Sagittarius, which is his 5th house. So you see things going on already. You see Donald Jr.,
right,
who's now going through a divorce. There's Eric, who's been exposed as weaseling funds out of a kid's cancer society and funneling them into dad's business. The latest news is Ivanka sort of sitting in as a kind of a de facto Secretary of Secretary of State. And you've got Melania's growing sense of unease with this whole thing. And then to look at this in yet another different way, if Trump has Leo rising,
he does, yeah.
Scorpio rules his 4th house. Now, for a politician, the 4th house is one's base. It's the population that supports you. It's it's the
equivalent of it's a sort of a symbolic home, a safety net. It's his base. Yes, exactly. Yep.
Well, it's your people. It's,
it's
think
your
of it,
people,
if you like, as your tribe. So we refer to this in political terms as Trump's political base. But an Indian chief would refer to his tribe. Taylor Swift would refer to her fans. So the fourth house, it's your constituency, especially in political terms. The fourth house is your constituency. And that's Scorpio for him. And that's ruled by Mars.
Right. Yep.
And now you could say, well, Scorpio is the fourth house political base. The seventh house, what could that be? That could be others of any kind. Well, that's Melania for one, but that is also your political opponents.
Yes, your
that
enemies,
is also
right? Yep.
That is also foreign affairs in some respects. You know, the other people with whom you must deal, across the aisle in Congress or across the ocean with respect to Putin. And there may be a looming clash around all this as well, too. And again, one or the other of the children could somehow be caught in this. How could this play out? Something with Donald Trump Jr. May go sour with respect to his, alleged dealings with the Russians in, facilitating these meetings that supposedly would give dirt on Hillary. This could go some other way with Ivanka's presumption of Secretary of State role.
Right. Or she's sort of taking in as his primary aide, maybe taking the place of Hope Hicks as well at the same time. But those are all
exactly. And how well is this going to go down, in the larger lens of international relations? So some of this fallout may come down on them, for instance, and now they're maybe regarded as surrogates for him. And in lieu of being able to, for the moment, impeach him or anything else, the fire, the children could be cast into the fire, as it were, as sort of a.
Well, they sort of have already. I mean, the part of the whole virtue of them being there, they've sort of already are in the fire. He dragged everybody along with him.
Yeah, and by extension, some of those that are being caught up in this. If you look at Trump's chart, this Mars-Saturn conjunction happens at 15 degrees Sagittarius, just short of that, 1450 Sagittarius. Directly across the chart from that is Mercury in his chart, which is, his political affiliates, I would say the people that are masters of their domain as far as politics go, friends, political supporters, financial supporters, and this is directly opposed to them as well, too. And so, this might transpire as some of this growing scandal from, frankly, it's like somebody who's got 3 or 4 house fires going on at the same time. It becomes a bit difficult to deal with all at the same time. And it must be starting to test the patience of some of his political allies, whether Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell or anonymous backers who have played a part in his success.
Oh, yeah, and he's not he always wants loyalty so badly, but he's so quick to discount people himself. He demands loyalty from others, and yet he's never reciprocal in that regard.
Yeah, so we might see some other friends.
He's got some real skeletons in his closet, and I think they may come. Yeah, exactly. They might decide that they've reached a point. You have to ask yourself, at what point do people begin to, especially the religious right base, when do they start to wake up and say, "Wow, we can only have so many affairs," and where's the line? What does the line come from? And I think this may be that point where that line gets, the spotlight shines on that line, perhaps.
Well, yeah, you've got to wonder about Mike Pence
oh my gosh.
And his wife. What do they talk about over the dinner table? Mike Pence, who won't even have lunch with another woman.
Oh, I know. And here he's got the exact opposite of himself there. I mean, it's really stark. Yeah. But he's keeping a low profile.
I mean, officially, he's his friend, right? In the White House. Of course. His best man, sort of. And I think, the 11th house is probably an appropriate significator for that. But this is, by this direct opposition, it's really testing that relationship, and it must be wearing pretty thin.
Oh, I'm sure it is. I guess the problem is that depending upon how far it goes and what role Pence would play in that, he may very well be the successor.
Well, yeah, you notice how absent he is from anything and everything these days.
Yeah.
He's practically invisible.
Yeah, he certainly is. And with good, I understand that probably he's trying to shield himself. I think everybody around him has said, shield yourself from this guy so you can get away, with somewhat a clean reputation. And he's sort of almost gone the other way to ensure that happens. He's very devout the other way. I mean, he's almost a fanatic in that regard.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, I don't have his chart, or else I could have brought some comment on that in, but not today.
Yeah. So we see all this happening on the world stage. And, of course, we see the desire for, and of course, he's becoming more animated with his tweets, and he's becoming more agitated, taking a lot of things into his own control. He has burned more bridges around the place than you can possibly imagine. The firing of Secretary of State. I mean, the list is just goes on and on and on out of his place. There's a lot of aggression and anger going on there, and a lot of unchecked sort of outrage all around him, it seems as if.
Well, and if you go back to that phrase that I loosely tossed off earlier, courtesy of my grandfather, all revved up with no place to go.
Right.
And if you look at the track record of the Trump presidency so far, I mean, he talks a good game and, look at everything we've done. But the reality is so little has been done. And
so little that has been done. And what has been done in many ways may actually alienate his base. It's alienate his base. Exactly. That's what I'm waiting to see happen. When people start seeing, the steel tariffs coming in, they can't get steel anymore or whatever, and they see their jobs not coming back, then there will be a severe backlash, I think.
Well, speaking of foreign relations and tariffs, for instance, and this bears on the chart as well too, saying how there's this potential conflict between regarding his base, Scorpio ruled, and regarding some foreign entity, Aquarius, Saturn ruled. So the latest little bit of news I saw is that China, having said, don't mess with tariffs or else we're going to, you're going to pay the price. Something I caught in the news just the other day, China said, okay, you're going to put tariffs on steel. You're going to try to hurt us. You know what we're going to do? We're going to put a tariff on soybeans. And we're basically going to attack your political base, Midwestern farmers who grow soybeans. They are going to, we're going to hold their feet to the fire, and you're going to hear their screams all the way from Washington.
Of course, and this is what they're all waiting for. I mean, they're going to be patient for so long. They maybe have been patient for a while, but I think when it begins to hit their and the same thing is going to be true for the tax cut that they issued. When that's only good for the regular middle class Joe like me for the next year. After that, it reverts to it's still whereas the benefit for corporations and businesses goes on ad infinitum.
Haven't you heard that Paul Ryan and others are now redefining the middle class as those who earn between $250,000 and $500,000 a year?
Oh, that's clever. That's good semantics. Yeah, I love that.
And they're benefiting from this tax bill. The other thing is that if you look at the U.S. chart, and I just sort of pulled this up today and didn't really have too much time to analyze it closely. But the U.S. chart in Vedic layout is a Scorpio rising. And so this becomes quite germane. And that makes Aquarius the fourth house. And so if you treat the first as the president, as the leader, as the embodiment of the nation, and Saturn as Lord of the fourth, representative of the base, you have this clash of Mars and Saturn. And now it occurs in Sagittarius, sidereal Sagittarius,
right,
which is America's second house,
right,
by birth chart.
Mm-hmm.
And there it opposes this cluster, the stellium of planets that in sidereal is Sun, Jupiter, Venus, and Mars in the Gemini 8th house of the U.S. chart. And so it's quite exact. And what's really going to get hammered here is some aspect of finance, because the Mars-Saturn conjunction is happening in sidereal Sagittarius. That's the U.S.'s second house. Sagittarius is the sign. The Lord is Jupiter. that Jupiter has gone to the 8th house. And so that represents a little bit of precariousness. I mean, but that's the natal chart. But the point is, this Mars-Saturn conjunction is exactly opposite, and I mean partile, within half a degree, opposite to that Jupiter. So typically when I see that in a person's chart, I'll say, look, there we've got 2 prime malefics are afflicting your 2nd house,
right,
and the 2nd house lord simultaneously.
Double
So
whammy.
that's a double whammy.
Yeah, and if you look and interesting enough, leading up into this discussion, as you mentioned, I mean, if you look at the stock market in the United States today, it's off 724 points. So that's a pretty big drop.
Oh no! Well, somebody saw something on news the other day that they're talking now about the Mueller index.
Oh,
and how as he continues to make advances, in building a case and further indictments and closing the doors,
following the money trail,
closing the walls, on his prey. That this is going to reflect, no investor likes uncertainty of any kind. And so the more uncertain this becomes as to the political fallout and the consequent financial fallout. I mean, if you look back many, many years ago, I mean, goodness, when Bill Clinton was being threatened with impeachment, the stock market was going through gyrations, and all we were talking about here was, hanky-panky in the Oval Office. Well, in this particular presidency, I mean, there's that multiplied by 6, and there's a whole lot of other stuff going on as well. That is huge for uncertainty, and the markets do not like uncertainty.
No, they
don't.
So
we might see some of this.
And the stock and the trade war that is being put in motion is a large part of the reason for this unshaky stocks. People do not know what that's going to look like, and if you're dealing with someone as big as China, you know that you're going to have the repercussions are going to be enormous.
And yet, quote unquote, trade wars are easy to win.
Easy to win, of course, yeah. And I can fix everything, as I also heard him say that. So.
Yeah, well, now when Mars and Saturn come clashing, we'll see how much fun a war is.
Yeah. Well, if it comes to that, I mean, hopefully it won't be a war of human cost or lives, but
no, but a trade war. A trade
war is, it could really screw up the economy.
And there are no winners.
Right.
It reduces trade for everybody. Somebody on both sides get hurt.
And so there goes the whole idea of and then there goes the profits. There goes the quote unquote trickle down, which is a joke in itself. But then there's no rationale for that. It's a real perfect storm.
Yeah. and all the uncertainties. I mean, and there is so much more. There's so many memes going around on Facebook, or basically the president can't even negotiate a successful deal with a porn star. How is he going to deal with Kim Jong-un?
Oh, of course. I mean, this whole thing is a joke. Well, part of the problem is he's not a realistic person. He has no basis in reality. I think his whole view of reality is through the lens of a camera somehow, and it's just it's not in touch with reality. But like you say, there are so many pots on top of the stove that are ready to boil over. We just, it's bound to happen. And, I think given the severity of what we're leading into and what the United States leading into, at least from a Western standpoint, is this enormous sort of redefinition of who our complete and utter sense of self, our sense of we're always seen as this prosperous nation, that we're supposed to be the great ambassadors for peace and justice in the democratic way. And we are just, they're just blowing holes in that argument left and right. And will be a grand reorganization coming up.
Well, that may very well be with, the whole thing around, guns is provoking a reaction among those who are most affected, which is, school children and college-age people, and,
right.
and they're about to be enfranchised in the sense that they're achieving their vote and they're finding their voice, and all the rest of that has.
And it brings to light the whole role, not only of the role of money, but the role of the NRA and its money in our political system, and why there's so many politicians that are afraid to take this stance, even though it couldn't be a clearer case. So this could be a real sort of Waterloo for one of these operations.
Yes, indeed. Food for thought.
Yeah, it's food for thought. I mean, we don't want. I don't want to be dire, but it's also wise to be prudent and to take stock of some of this stuff. I mean, we may not have the disasters we speak of, but we may see it happen in other ways. But the fact that something will happen, I think, is fairly obvious, and it's just a matter of time. We see so many pieces falling into place that sort of lead us right to this, which is one of the things I love about astrology. You can see these big events happening prior to. There's this logic of this sort of marching to this tune where this spot happens, and it's incredible to watch.
Often the timing is there. It's the consequence that I think we struggle most with.
Of course, yeah.
Because we could see war looming. I mean, who back in the late 1930s didn't see war looming with Germany?
Of course,
but no one knew how that would play out.
Right. And we don't know how this will play out. Would this turn into a war in an effort to distract? I mean, you talk about a distraction. If we started firing rockets at North Korea, then a lot of the Mueller investigation maybe would be secondary news.
Well, for a little while.
For a little while.
Mueller still has a mandate, and he's not going to be going away. He won't retire because of that.
Right, I know, and I think that if I look at this in the view, I think that I've had this discussion with many people about. I think what would happen, rather than go through the process of impeachment, his ego would never be able to stand that. He would opt to resign because it's better to quit a job than to be fired. That puts you in charge.
Absolutely, and you can almost see that coming. It's a wonder that he doesn't have a heart attack because you can imagine stress.
Yeah, stress is there, and he's a very excitable, high-strung kind of guy with a terrible diet, overweight. You could easily see all that coming to fruition. And I think he's put himself in a position where I am sure more than he's whining for his past days where he was a private citizen and could go and do what he wanted. Now he's got the microscope on him all the time. He couldn't have put himself in a worse position.
Indeed.
But that's the failure of his ego. His ego got the better of him and just took him down this road. Had to do it.
Well, they say beware of what you wish for, right?
Oh, I know all too well. Yeah, I know. And because you sort of, and I think on a subconscious level, you sort of put that in motion, and then your ego drives become that, and you start getting lost in this fantasy. He has this, he's obsessed with the election numbers. This is a thing that, the reason he doesn't want to concede to Russia, one of the major reasons is that he doesn't want to admit that he didn't do it by himself. He wants to take credit for this victory on his own. He wants to, he wants to repair everything. I can fix it. No one can better than me.
Speaking of resignation, this whole thing about this particular Mars-Saturn conjunction, this planetary war occurring in his fifth house, he may see the writing on the wall for his children.
I think so.
That if he goes down, it will take them with him. And it could be one of those things that could provoke a bit of rational thought in a person's mind to say, maybe I should bail out, maybe I should resign, and that will take the heat off of me and my family. Else I risk taking everybody with me.
Right, and I think we're seeing that already on. I think the children, once they start following the money, the children are going to come involved because there's this whole thing called the emoluments clause, which they really have not looked into. There's nobody there is pushing any of the agenda of this because it's a Republican-controlled Congress. But if they start to see all the conflicts of interest that are there between his companies and the work his children are doing, and then trying to buy influence. I mean, just this week, the Saudi Arabians were there, meeting with them, having deals behind closed doors. This is clear, and no one is stopping it because they know this is a Republican president, Republican Congress. They can use him as a puppet, which is what they're doing. They're playing him for a puppet.
In terms of following the logic in his chart, Chris, do you know who comes first? Who's the elder child? Is it Ivanka or Donald Jr.?
I think it's Ivanka. Yeah, I'm pretty sure she was first. There's another daughter. There's another daughter out there. I think it goes Ivanka, Don, Eric. I think there's a Jennifer, and then there's Barron. So they're through three different marriages. But I believe Ivanka is the oldest, and I could be mistaken. If not, and then it's Donald Jr.
Yeah. So when we look at Trump's fifth house, we are thinking of children in general, but we're thinking of the first child specifically.
Then I think that probably would be. I mean, I know Ivanka's been under scrutiny, but I think Donald Jr. now having these problems with him being involved with the Russian meeting in the Trump Tower and now going through the divorce, he could easily see, the public, spotlight on him in a way that is making his father a bit uncomfortable, I'm sure.
No kidding.
I mean, I think if nothing else, I think the man would have enough, although I can't say this, never having met him or anything else, would have enough paternal, sort of desire to protect his tribe, his offspring, over anything else. At least that's how I would feel as a parent. I would feel like I would do anything to protect my children.
I just checked Wiki, and it is Donald Jr. who comes first.
Okay, that makes sense.
So he's the child who's indicated by Trump's fifth house, if you want to get specific about children. And then comes Ivanka, and because her relation to Donald Jr. is, siblings always follow 3 houses later, right? If you have a younger sibling, it's the 3rd house. And if they have a younger sibling, it's the next house further, or 3 houses later. So in Trump's chart, then Donald Jr. is indicated by the 5th house, and Ivanka is indicated by the 7th house. So interestingly enough, that 7th house is the Aquarius ruled.
It's interesting. It's fun. There's a sort of an odd sort of symbolic question that raises there too, because we've always seen people made many jokes about his affair, his relationship with Ivanka, and we always think of that as an unusually kind of, incestuous kind of relationship. Yeah. Yeah.
That reminds me of one of these other ladies who's waiting in the queue. Is it the woman Zervos?
Yes, yeah. She's the one that was on the reality show, right? Yeah.
She kind of looks a little bit like
I know. There's a lot of similarities all the way through, and it's very unusual. It's a made for TV soap opera is what it is. I mean, it's actually better. It's the fact that it's real is even more disturbing. But
back to Trump's chart with that Mars Saturn conjunction in his 5th house. That's affecting first and foremost Donald Jr.
Yes.
And because his wife is directly opposite, that's the Mercury I alluded to earlier.
Okay.
In Trump's chart. It's that marriage that is most affected because that Mars Saturn conjunction is directly, exactly opposed to his Mercury in the 11th house.
And she has a motive now to speak. She has a motive now to speak, whereas before she didn't. She may come out and spill the beans on something that people haven't heard of before because she's sort of the bitter divorcee or, the one who's been done wrong.
Is she bitter, or is this a common agreement saying,
I don't know.
This ship is sinking, you should get off now?
I don't think it's a question of the ship is sinking, you should get off now. I think it's the fact that he had an affair with somebody from The Apprentice and she's probably scorned.
This is years ago, though.
Well, doesn't matter. I mean, yeah, she maybe just put up with it. Maybe put up for so long, and now maybe the spotlight is too much for her. I could easily see that. Who wants to have that?
Yeah, it could be that as the scrutiny ratchets up, and especially the follow the money strategy.
Of course, and once that happens, and once Mueller gets to the money, this is what amazes me. It's the thing that bothers me the most is the time involved. It's just going so slow. I understand how so slow things go, but I just think that it's all there. It's just a matter of putting the pieces together. But they got to do it methodically. So,
well, the entire Trump and Kushner family web is hugely leveraged.
Oh, I know that. I know.
They may literally be bankrupt without us knowing it, right? Once it all unravels.
Oh, I think very much so. Yeah, because I know
Kushner's wife may be exiting with some money now while she can.
Well, she can, because I know that the Kushner's properties he's got a loan due that he does not have money for yet, and so they're probably frantically running around trying to get cash from somebody else to help cover that loan. So it's a lot, and it'll be interesting to be able to. We should probably, have a talk in a couple months to see how it all went down and see how salient these points are. But they certainly seem to be right on the money. And it's uncanny. This is what I love about astrology. I mean, you can see all these players unfolding, coming out on the stage, and the aspects are there, and it's really rich with symbology, and and history. And it's just a phenomenal sort of unfolding right before our eyes. It's a fascinating thing to watch. Unfortunately, though, we have run out of time. I appreciate you very much coming on today. And I love the fact that you're able to dance between the Vedic and the Western astrology so fluidly. You really have a strong handle on both of them, and it's just great. I'm not anywhere, I don't know my way around Vedic astrology at all, but to hear you talk about it makes it more palatable, and I love that about what you've been able to provide.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. So anyway, my guest today has been Alan Annand. His web address is Navamsa. It's NAVAMSA.com. That's an Indian word for, what is it, a Sanskrit word for what?
Means ninth harmonic.
Ninth harmonic. What could be better? There you go. Perfect. Wow. Yeah. Very good. Navamsa, NAVAMSA.com. Alan Annand, he's out of Toronto. Wonderful astrologer. We'll dance around Vedic or we'll dance around Western, and we'll even read your palm if you ask him.
Great. So, thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah, sure. It's great having you on again, Alan. Thanks so much for coming on today, and be well. And let's watch what happens with the war coming up.
Okay, let's take care.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.